We have long resisted asking you for guidance. Perhaps we have feared in doing so, we might acknowledge that our individuality, which we so revere, is not entirely our own. Perhaps we have feared an appeal to you might be taken for weakness. But we have come to understand, finally, that this is not so.
Before the Revolutionary War erupted, William Jr. was the only buster who left Virginia, heading further south to Caswell and Orange counties in North Carolina. He would be part of the first wave to move out of Virginia. The motivation for his move is not entirely clear, and one could only imagine how Jane felt about leaving her extended family with over 150 miles between them. Edgar Woods noted this migration in his book, expressing that migratory spirit was rapidly developed at this period. 70 years prior, Carolina was used as an escape route for servants and people who were in deep debt. When Sir William Berkeley was governor of Virginia, he complained,
"Carolina always was and is the sink of America, the refuge of our renegades."
But by the time William Jr. decided to venture there, sometime between 1750 and 1751, he may not have necessarily been avoiding debt. There are two other possibilities for this migration that he was a part of. One, it was during this time when the Cherokee started to rebel because they had been forced to compete with the Anglos, who not only continued to bombard their hunting grounds, but continued to strip away their resources and livelihood. The resentment had hit a high point. The swelling of violence finally escalated into a much larger war, the French and Indian War. And two, there was some truth in Berkeley's claim about North Carolina. Although there were many renegades roaming freely for decades, whether the renegades were settlers or colonial officials, the attraction of less regulations could have tickled William Jr.'s free spirit. There was a comfort in knowing less government involvement and also direct trading with other Southerners who understood each other, driving a wider distance with the Easterners who often carried a superior opinion against the backcountry folk. Whatever the reasons for William Jr.'s move, he only stayed for 2 decades and ended up returning to his birth home. Why? Well, understanding the instability of North Carolina would have one conclude a pretty good guess. Just 10 years ahead of the Revolutionary War, a revolt against the local colonial officials flared up, known as the War of the Regulation. There were few in charge actually enforcing the law, thereby perpetuating a gap in the seam of law and order. This gap gave free rein for corruption from the officials and groups of gangs to terrorize the frontier. As the population inflated in North Carolina, a single province was responsible for the law of the entire territory, which was in Charleston. Voting, lawsuits, imprisonment, marriage bonds, etc. all had to be completed in one place, near the coast, making it difficult for settlers to take care of these matters by traveling long distances. Bribery, extortion, increased taxations, and illegal fees infected the civil system that was supposed to maintain a healthy community. Despite petitions repetitively brought to the Common House of Assemblies between 1766 through 67, nothing was done. People turned to a vigilante principle. In 1759, settlers of Orange County kidnapped a tax agent and held him for ransom. Soon others formed groups and began to burn cabins, threaten people, and even murder a few. 5 counties were affected the most: Orange, Granville, Rowan, Anson, and Cumberland. It was estimated in Orange County alone, about 7,000 settlers out of 8,000 supported the regulators. The movement spread to South Carolina as well, but fared far worse due to the violent terrors from bandits. This sounds more like the Wild West than the colonial era, doesn't it? By 1771, newly appointed Governor William Tyrone had enough of this regulation movement and quickly squashed the rebellion at the Battle of Alamance by military force. William Jr. had enough too, because in 1772, with his wife and then 8 children, he sold his over 600-acre land and returned to Virginia. At this point, the Assembly finally expanded their court system into 6 new districts, and Governor Tyrone and the Presbyterian ministers pressured the regulators, alongside of their sympathizers, to sign loyalty oaths in order to avoid persecution, which could result in hanging. As a final punishment, Tyrone ordered to have their lands destroyed. All the while, he implemented a tax rise to pay for the colonial militia's effort against the regulators. Since William Jr. had once lived in Orange County when it all began, if he wasn't directly involved in the movement, he may have been at least a sturdy supporter. Unfortunately, that part of his life does remain unclear, and we are left with assumptions based on the time frame where he had lived and when he had conveniently left. Although some historians have argued the regulation movement was a precursor to the War of Independence, notably dealing with issues of taxation and voting rights, however, other issues of rent, property security, and the gentry class dominating inside the government, it became more about class division rather than wanting to break away from the United Kingdom. And many of the regulators who signed the loyalty oath did in fact remain loyal to the crown during the Revolution. The Scotch-Irish, however, held a different view, so by the time rebellion again swept through all colonies, a great majority of them became patriots without a second thought. In Albemarle County alone, only 6 people were recorded harboring British sympathies, and therefore had been penalized by having their land confiscated. At the beginning of the Revolutionary War, it was first presumed the war was inspired purely by religious motivation rather than a political one. Religious wars had spread within Central and Northern Europe, starting in 1524 with the rise of the Protestant Reformation and ended with a peace treaty in 1648. Historically speaking, because religion had converted into a political cause, the assumption that the American War happened to be an extension of a religious faction was naturally interpreted as such. This belief started with the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians in Pennsylvania. When the war burst into flames, the British government was searching for excuses, not taking full responsibility for the alienation against their American subjects. During the early phase of the war, a report to King George III indeed defined the rebellion as a Presbyterian war. Whig politician Horace Walpole asserted in Parliament,
"There is no use crying about it. Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson, and that is the end of it."
A Tory from New York vented in his letter a year into the war,
"Presbyterianism is really at the bottom of the whole conspiracy, has supplied it with vigor, and will never rest till something is decided upon it."
The support many Scotch-Irish Presbyterians ensued for the war was committed instantly and with fierce dedication. Following the Boston Tea Party Rebellion, people of Augusta County, which later would become West Virginia, sent 137 barrels of flour to aid the poor. William Jr.'s son, Charles, moved to Augusta from Albemarle County just before the war and could have been a contributor to Boston. Also, although David died in Augusta in 1797, he too may have been present. The few busters who did relocate to their neighboring county of Augusta had done so either during the war or shortly thereafter. The protection needed against the invading armies, as well as the ongoing dispute with Native Americans, were considered just as vital. Many of the busters served in the militia rather than the Continental Army. When the Virginia militia was first established in 1607 as a means to secure the British colony despite encroaching on other people's land, which provoked bloody territorial wars, by the time the Revolutionary War erupted, the militia fought alongside of the Continental Army. Under Article 13 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, it states that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state, that standing armies in a time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. Men of color were forbidden to join, and it differed from the Continental Army by the way of location and its leaders. The Continental Armies began in Massachusetts, funded by the Continental Congress, and were commanded by generals from New England, George Washington being a special case. To fill the gaps in the armies, local militias were employed in all 13 states. After the war, while the Continental Armies slowly transformed into the United States military, the Virginia militia continued to be of use by remaining to fill in the military gaps, mainly to fight against the local natives, as it had done so for almost 2 centuries. It also served another purpose, to keep slave rebellions under control. The militia in general wouldn't officially become the National Guards until 1903, despite the term National Guard had been in use since 1824. Although the militia still exists today, but as unorganized militias where they are ran privately rather than by state. William Sr. had 4 out of his 6 sons serving in the Virginia militias: William Jr., John, David, and Claudius, who would become a major. His grandson, also named Claudius, would serve as a private. The accomplishment of the American Revolution set the Busters forward with the rest of the country. Those who served were not only recognized, but rewarded. Major Claudius and cousin Michael Woods were granted land for their services, much like what had been done for centuries under the English military rewards for knighthood. Private Claudius since then served as Justice of the Peace and Sheriff, and thereby became a pensioner, while in Augusta he was allotted $20 per year. Their prosperity was outlined in political principles, guided by their Presbyterian faith. Despite attempting to divide the concept of religion and government, even men like John Quincy Adams couldn't quite do it, interpreting the two as one. It kept up morale for 13 years during the war, to be certain, and needed to be so in order to break away from one of the largest empires of its time. Religion also continued to outline the foundation of manifest destiny while keeping slavery in position.